Is China trying to create a new world order? Well, Ian Easton, the author of The Final Struggle, Inside China's Global Strategy, thinks so. Ian, it's great to have you on the show.
Natalie, thanks so much for having me on the show. It's great to see you. It's great to be back.
You believe that China is trying to dominate and control the world. Tell me why you believe this.
What we're dealing with, unfortunately, is a one-party dictatorship that believes it has a superior system of government, superior ideology, and it wants to export that system around the world and to create what they euphemistically refer to as a new world order, which would be a system of global dictatorships.
So how big of a threat do you think China is to global democracies?
Well, as my boss Randy Shriver said in the foreword to the book, this is a threat like none that we've ever faced before. Certainly not in the last 150 years of American foreign policy. We've never faced an adversary that had not only the kind of military power that China has today, but perhaps even more importantly, the kind of economic clout that they have, the kind of scientific clout and capability and technological capability. And perhaps even more important than all of that is we're in a competition with a government, a country that we're very tightly tied to in so many different ways, including within our critical infrastructure, including within our own economic health. And so that makes competition very complicated, to put it mildly, and very challenging.
So how do you think this affects the average person around the world?
It impacts everybody in different ways. We saw it in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic in March of 2020, when we learned that China's government was actually holding the health of Americans hostage for political reasons, that they were denying the shipment of N95 masks that 3M makes in China, actually in Wuhan, China. And they were not going to send those to the United States. And so hospitals around America were going to have to go without PPE. And they were going to have to cancel procedures and surgeries and all manner of things of that nature. Even now, we rely very heavily on China for our PPE and also for our testing kits. And according to the Department of Homeland Security, a lot of testing kits that we get from China are actually counterfeit. And a lot of the PPE that we've gotten from China tends to break, and it's not clear whether or not that's intentional or not, but certainly it puts our health at risk. And so that's one area where absolutely everybody's impacted. Another area is that issue of the narrative, so our freedom of expression. We all, in democracies everywhere, we hold freedom of speech, freedom of expression dear. And unfortunately now, many Americans, depending on who you work for, if you work for the NBA, for example, you cannot criticize China's government. You cannot talk about how you personally feel solidarity and support for the Uyghur people that are suffering genocide in Xinjiang right now, or Tibetans or Taiwanese. And if you do that, the NBA will fire you. They have a track record now of doing that. Hotel chains like Marriott International has fired employees for even liking a tweet by the Dalai Lama. And the list just goes on and on.
Well, what about us here in Taiwan? You wrote actually the Chinese invasion threat, analyzing the possibility of China attacking Taiwan. Now that China has become so hostile, and especially in recent years, with all the warplanes coming near Taiwan, what do you think about the likeliness of them trying to attack Taiwan in the very near future?
The great debate right now is whether or not Xi Jinping is operating according to a timeline, and he will invade Taiwan by 2027. Some people say it could be as early as 2024, 2025, or whether or not he keeps an open mind and he's relying on other means to achieve that same objective. But I think it is increasingly clear that China's military is building up with a tremendous sense of urgency, that they are getting ready to invade Taiwan. So they will be ready when ordered to do that. And there's also a very large scale campaign of coercion that's going on every day in the Taiwan Strait. And unfortunately, that campaign of coercion is working. And so it also may be the case that Xi Jinping is convinced himself that he won't ultimately need to invade Taiwan. He'll be able to crumble Taiwanese democracy actually without a fight.
How do you think that we can protect our democracy with such a gigantic adversary like China?
I personally believe that the first step is for all of us to educate ourselves on the worldview of Xi Jinping himself, his lived experiences, his biography, and the plans and the intentions of the entire Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state. We need to take a very careful look at judging the state of play in terms of strategic competition, who's winning, who's losing, where do the trend lines point. And just, I can tell you from my own personal experience over the past 3 years, when you do that, there's a bit of a wake-up moment that occurs, and you start to think to yourself, oh my God, they could be winning and we could be losing, and so we better get our act together and reform our policies and reform our behavior accordingly.
In your book, you also mentioned about Xi Jinping's past. That was actually, he had a very traumatic past. During the Cultural Revolution, he was subject to hard labor, and he was renounced by his mother. How do you think this affects his leadership and his mentality now?
You know, unfortunately, I think we're looking at an entire generation and perhaps multiple generations of elites in China, political elites in China, that have been brutalized. They were brutalized by the regime starting at a very young age. They lived through traumatic experiences. In Xi Jinping's case, he was raised by parents who themselves were brutalized and traumatized by the communist revolution. I mean, Xi Jinping's dad went to prison for attempted murder when he himself, this is Xi Zhongxun, Xi Jinping's dad, was still a teenager. And then when Xi Jinping was a teenager, his dad went to prison again. And he wasn't sure if he was going to live or die. This is a regime that brutalizes people, and I think that sometimes gets reflected in their behavior once they grow into power.
What do you think the chances of them crumbling are?
It all depends, I think, on what the people of China do, but perhaps even more importantly, it depends on what the people of democracies such as the United States and Taiwan do. If we continue to actively support them, invest in them, provide them with talent and technology, provide them with a platform in international organizations, which they tend to come to dominate, then we'll lose. There's no question. If we stay on the path that we're on today, we will lose and they will win. It's just that simple. So we have to change. And if we do change, as I believe we're perfectly capable of, if we reform our China policies, then we will be in a much better place. And we will be able to use the many competitive advantages that we have, because we have so many latent advantages. We just have yet to marshal the will to use those advantages.
Is there anything you'd like to say to people in Taiwan or around the world?
It's true that the threat is considerable. It's like nothing we've ever faced before. But it's also true that democracies have an unparalleled ability to adapt, to be flexible, to be dynamic, and to do things that will surprise everybody. We see this today with Ukraine and the Ukrainian democracy. They're doing things that are absolutely blowing everybody around the world away. And there's no reason Americans can't do that and act that way, and Taiwanese can't act that way.
Well, thank you so much, Ian, for your book, The Final Struggle, Inside China's Global Strategy. And thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Natalie, it's my great pleasure. Thanks for having me on your show.